Since 2002, the amount of outstanding owner-occupier mortgages has been in decline, partly due to older, wealthier generations moving from mortgaged properties to ownership outright. But more importantly, there's been a decline in the amount of first-time buyers being able to get onto the ladder. UK Finance reported that the number of mortgaged first-time buyers fell 22.4% in 2023, compared to the previous calendar year. I think there was a glimmer of hope or maybe some optimism that rising interest rates would lead to a significant drop in house prices, improving the ability to get on the ladder. But probably unsurprisingly, rising rates have made it even harder. There are major barriers you need to get over when purchasing your first home. Not only is it an issue to get the deposit together, but also affording the mortgage repayments themselves, which are now significantly higher than they were. Such are the challenges that first-time buyers face, which this report goes into in detail. And I want to look at some of the findings of the report and also the solutions it gives to fix the problem. On page 6, they have a picture of some avocado toast, which, I thought was pretty funny. And the report remarks, attempts to explain challenges to older, typically homeowning generations can still end up with responses along the lines of, rates were higher in my day, you just need to save or eat less avocado toast. I think that's a bit of a stereotype. I know plenty of older people who acknowledge the difficulties for younger buyers. But if you're unconvinced, this report does a pretty good job of spelling out what buying a home is like today versus, say, the past. Possibly the most expensive it's been over at least the last 70 years. So just how expensive is it? There are two costs to factor in when buying a home, as we discussed before. The cost of purchase, which includes the deposit and also things like solicitors' fees, and then the cost of maintaining the home itself. The biggest cost here would be the mortgage cost. Since 1974, the combination of these costs has fluctuated, and there have actually been points where the buyers found it relatively affordable versus the average, here in the 80s and then here in the mid-90s, where both the lines fall below zero. Today, both repayments and especially deposit requirements are very high. Repayment costs are at the same relative levels as pre-financial crisis, and deposit levels have reached ridiculously high rates. The average first-time buyer deposit now is £60,000. It ranges from £27,000 in the northeast to £144,000 in London. You can see why, without family support and two high income earners, the ability to save that amount is really out of reach for many. But there is an interesting discussion here around how the recent housing market compares to that of previous generations. It's very much true that this is not the first time we've seen high interest rates. As an example, rates were significantly higher than they are today in the 90s and 80s. And a common pushback that you'll hear when people complain about rates today is, well, when I bought my house, interest rates were 12%. The report comments on this. Comparing housing affordability across generations is fraught with danger. Danger's probably a bit strong, isn't it? But the way we buy houses in terms of style of mortgage, interest only, repayment or endowment, changes over time. You have the fact that a large portion of the younger population now have a degree as well, and then the associated student debt repayment alongside their housing costs, which worsens any affordability. Or how about the crazy fact that women couldn't even open their own bank accounts in recent living memory? These sort of things make direct comparison pretty tricky, but this chart attempts to do that, and it paints a really clear picture. Kind of clear picture. It's not clear at all, is it? What the hell is going on here? The point is, interest rates alone are not enough of a comparison. The other component is how big the loan is relative to income. This issue can be demonstrated by the fact that 12% of 2 is the same as 6% of 4. So you can see that even though interest rates were much higher in the past, the loan to income multiplier, how much debt they had versus their income, was significantly lower. And that means, as you can see from this blue line here, the recent rate rises mean that homeowners today exposed to rapid rate rises, or even first-time buyers looking to get on the ladder, are seeing the same or similar proportions of income go out of the door on housing as other points in time when rates were much higher. We shouldn't dismiss the struggles of modern home ownership as simply, oh, well, you shouldn't have bought a house you couldn't afford, it's your own fault, put down the avocado you won't melt and get down the mines and do some real work. Just because the headline numbers are different, the impact as a total proportion of income is very much the same, and the struggles of people today share a lot in common with those of the early 90s. But one thing that is fair to say is the scale of the problem is not the same across the nation. I now want to look at some regional data, as we can be guilty of focusing on averages which tend to be heavily influenced by areas where the problem is worse, namely London and the South East. This table does a great job of showing the range of issues, but also highlights this is still very much a national problem. The average person needs 1 full year's gross salary to get on the ladder, and then they need to borrow about 3.2 times their income. In London, it's 1.5 times your gross salary for a deposit, and in the North East, it's still 60% of your gross salary. That's a massive amount to save, isn't it? Especially in a cost of living crisis. While areas in the UK are more affordable, I don't think it's fair to say that it's easy to get a house in some areas of the UK. I'm sure there are examples of dirt cheap houses in areas, but what are the job prospects like there? I often hear people say, Compromise on location so you can get on the ladder and then build up from there. It's this idea that you get onto the first step of the property market with a small flat or terraced house, or by living in an area that is not where you actually want or need to live. Then over time you kind of build your way up through to larger properties. This idea is central to the British market and how we view housing in this country. But the paper does an excellent job at looking at why this concept of a ladder might not hold true anymore. The conditions of the last 70 years have allowed many first-time buyers to quickly build housing equity through leverage and rising prices. This process was the underlying driver of the so-called housing ladder, building equity and borrowing more thanks to rising wages and falling mortgage rates. Unfortunately, it appears the economic conditions that allowed a housing ladder might have been an exception. The idea that you can buy a cheap flat in a city centre that doubles in value in a few years and then use that to buy a big house in the country just can't scale forever, can it? You can't even buy a cheap flat white in a city centre anymore. For many recent and future first-time buyers, it's quite likely that their mortgage will be a marathon rather than a sprint, with the underlying economic climate working against them. That means for many first-time buyers, unless they progress through work and see their incomes rise, or receive an inheritance or a gift or some kind of support, they might be in their first home for much longer than they expected or would have liked to have been. So is a 2-bed flat or terraced house the suitable option for them for a prolonged period of time? What if they want to start a family? This can mean overall transactions in the market decline as less people constantly move up the ladder. It's a relatively bleak picture, isn't it? Whereby the only real chance you have to get yourself a home is if you're a couple with a high income or receive inheritance or gifts from family. I want to now shift the focus to some suggested solutions because look, I think the data I've just covered won't really come as a surprise to you. Before we do that though, let me tell you about today's video sponsor, Manual. I've been a customer of Manual's now for months and I've been happy with the results. As you can see, my hair looks a lot thicker here than it did on this image of me taken from the podcast a few months ago. Everything is done online. You just go on their website, complete a quick questionnaire, and then they will send you a box of stuff in the post to your door. No need to leave the house. All treatments they provide are UK licensed and clinically proven, and the main one being minoxidil. I've left a number of medical journals below that go into the benefits of applying minoxidil for the prevention and reversal of hair loss. I do want to say that I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with your hair thinning with age or going bald gracefully for that matter, but there's absolutely nothing graceful about me, and I'm going to hold on to my follicles as long as humanly possible. Because honestly, I got a head shape like something out of a 1980s James Cameron movie. If you want to try out Manual for yourself, then use the link in the description or the one in the pinned comment and input code DTM55 for 55% off your first order. A new government should commit to a package of housing policies that make homes more affordable, more available, and more appropriate to the needs of those living in them. Sounds simple, doesn't it? The government should just fix the problems. The opening suggestion is that the government should commission an independent review. I'm sure that's exactly what first-time buyers want to hear. But they suggest lenders, investors, house builders, regulators, academics, and other experts suggest policy changes. Long-term fixed-rate mortgages and using pensions for a deposit are two suggestions. On the first one, it feels like we might go the way of Japan with a 100-year mortgage where you pay it and then your kids inherit the debt as well. I'm not sure this is a vision of home ownership most people have. Maybe a 40 or 50-year term is something people would take on to get themselves a home, but you need to then factor in the total cost of home ownership as well. As stretching a loan out over more decades just means the amount of interest that you pay will go up significantly. The pension point is interesting. I talk about pensions a lot, and I've called out the Mansion House reforms, which will look into dip into work-based default schemes to fund UK startups. So this idea of you could dip into your pension to buy a house, to me, fills me with dread. I think people's desire to own a home is so strong and their commitment to their future selves is so weak that they would just use up all of their pension to get a house, only kicking a much bigger can further down the road in the forms of retirement savings. I did make a video the other day that showed it's very much possible to save for retirement in your later years, and I'll link that at the end. So maybe if the money was available for a deposit in your early years, that might help. But considering the average pension pot in the UK for someone at 30 is around 10k, I'm not sure how much that's going to move the needle. I'm making this up on the spot, so it's probably full of holes, but could the pension amount factor into the affordability calculations? Or could a charge be placed on the pension itself to help people get into a home without dipping into the pot? Maybe on the understanding that when they can access the 25% tax-free lump sum from their pot, that they use that to pay off the mortgage if they haven't done so already. Again, probably a terrible idea and it would be really complex, but I would rather see solutions where we leverage the power of the pension without actually sticking our hands in the cookie jar. The second suggestion is a simple one. Government should build more homes. The decline in local authority house building has been monumental, as you can see from the green here. A nationwide government house building programme rolled out by local authorities would provide new supply where it is needed. Those homes could remain owned by the government, a form of asset on the government's balance sheet, if you will, while stimulating the economy through the spending associated with building them. The increase of rental units as well would reduce the pressure on the rental sector and the demand there, which would hopefully reduce rental costs for people, that need to rent, giving them the ability to save more to buy a home. The issue we have is the government has absolutely no money, and Labour, who look like they might get into power, have committed to not borrowing any more money. Borrowing money to pay for the running costs of the country is like paying for your food shopping on a credit card. Borrowing money to invest in housing and infrastructure, these sorts of things, is like taking out a loan to invest in new equipment. Very different propositions. And I think this is one area where the government could do with being brave and investing. It doesn't need to be millions of houses instantly. The government could just use a drip feed of new homes, some sold, some owned by the government and, rented out, to ensure that house price growth does not continue to outstrip wage growth long term. Just sort of rebalance things over time without crashing house prices short term and then pissing off everyone who already owns a home. Just a commitment to building quality homes that are truly affordable, would be lovely. I appreciate that no one wants extra homes in their area without an increase in the local facilities at least. So alongside this, planning would also need to be reformed, with a greater focus on strategic planning and less focus on development control. While you're at it, the paper points out that taxation is an area that also needs reform. We saw in the pandemic just how impactful changes in taxation can be on the prices of houses. The removal of stamp duty made the market go crazy. We can use taxation to create outcomes for those who need help, but this would need to be done really carefully to ensure the right outcomes. As an example, current inheritance tax rules and the resident nil band rate means that older people are incentivised to stay in valuable homes so their loved ones avoid inheritance tax charges. But that means you get this situation where old people stay in their absolute massive mansions using only 2 rooms when they would have downsized, just rattling around in the place. There's a few more recommendations as part of the paper, and I've included the full 40-page document, as well as a quicker to read executive summary for anyone who wants to take a look down below. We all know that the housing market in the UK is a mess, and while the figures in this report might be validating to some, they're probably unsurprising to many, as are the proposed changes that the report calls them modern solutions. I mean, building more houses is hardly a modern suggestion, is it? To be fair, taxation and regulation are modern in this context, but this is a well-worn discussion, and this report is just the latest data. But as we approach an election, the incoming government has the opportunity to be a bit brave and radical, and the housing market is one area that is just crying out for change. Without that change, generations will continue to have to make sacrifices on life to get themselves on the ladder. But is that sacrifice worth making? I mean, sure, you have a nice 2 up, 2 down in a semi-decent location, but do you still have a cardo?
Baby, we built this house on memories. Take my picture